Germany faced its war crimes head-on, in a way the whole world could see. Japan didn't, at least not in the same public, nationwide way. And the reason isn't people didn't know, it's gatekeepers, the people who decide what gets into schools, TV, and bookstores. Because what a country remembers is what it teaches. But here's the twist. When those gates tried to close, they often did the opposite. They didn't shrink the story, they spread it. This video follows 3 moments centered on Japan where censorship backfired so hard it turned hidden history into something people went looking for. The first of these 3 moments starts with a book. Tokyo, 1983. Inside a warehouse that most people would walk past without a second thought. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights humming, workers in blue jackets stacking boxes like it's just another Tuesday. Except this time, there are cameras. And the boxes aren't going out to bookstores, they're coming back. The book being loaded onto those pallets is called The Devil's Gluttony by Seiichi Morimura. And it's not just any book, it's a bestseller. The kind that gets talked about at dinner parties, recommended between friends, debated in coffee shops. The book exposes something called Unit 731. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. And that's kind of the point. Unit 731 was a secret wartime program where Japanese scientists developed biological weapons and conducted experiments on prisoners. Yeah, that kind of experiments. For most people in Japan at the time, this wasn't dinner table conversation. It wasn't taught in schools. It lived in the shadows. Academic papers nobody read, rumours nobody confirmed, fragments of stories that old people whispered about but never explained. Then suddenly, here it is. In print, popular, selling like crazy. And then, just as suddenly, it's being pulled. A publisher spokesperson steps up to the microphones and delivers a line that sounds perfectly reasonable. We're recalling the book due to a photo problem. One image needs correcting. Notice the language here. Photo problem. Technical, managerial. The kind of corporate speak that makes everything sound like a minor paperwork issue. It's the equivalent of saying, we're experiencing technical difficulties when the building's on fire. But here's what publishers and governments and anyone who tries to control information always forget. A recall isn't quiet. A recall is a flare. Because the moment you pull a book off shelves, you're not just removing it, you're marking it. You're painting a target on it. You're basically holding up a sign that says, there's something in here someone is nervous about. And when people sense that, they ask the most dangerous question in the world. Why? Why are you nervous? In Tokyo, used copies start vanishing within days. Readers who never cared about wartime history are suddenly hunting for this book like it's a limited edition sneaker drop. Bookstores are getting called constantly. Do you have Devil's Gluttony? When will you get more copies? Newspapers start writing articles. But here's what's brilliant. They're not just writing about Unit 731 anymore. They're writing about the recall itself. So now there are 2 stories. What happened in Unit 731 and why is this being pulled right now? That second question? That's dynamite. Because it's not about the past, it's about power in the present. It's about who gets to decide what you're allowed to know today. The book doesn't fade away, it explodes. Other publishers start printing their own editions. Commentary spreads. Television segments happen, academic discussions. The whole thing snowballs. The gate tried to close with, "This is just a correction." But the public heard, "There's something here we're not supposed to see." And once people feel that, staring becomes the point. But that's just the first moment. Because while publishers could recall one book, what happens when the government tries to control what an entire generation learns in school? That brings us to the second moment. And it's about a different kind of gate entirely. If publishers shape what adults read, textbooks shape what kids grow up thinking is normal. Textbooks aren't just information, they're a national mirror. They tell children, this is what your country thinks matters enough to memorize. For decades, Japan has had a textbook screening system. Here's how it works. Publishers submit drafts. Government reviewers go through them. Reviewers can demand changes. If publishers refuse, the book doesn't get approved for schools. And standard is everything. Because a book that's not approved might exist, but it's not shaping millions of young minds every single year. On paper, this sounds like quality control, making sure things are accurate, right? But there's a razor-thin line between accuracy and acceptable narrative. And when institutions control that line, the argument stops being about one sentence. It becomes about who gets to draw the boundary. Enter Saburo Ienaga, a historian who decided that boundary was worth fighting for. Starting in the mid-1960s, Ienaga begins suing the government over textbook screening. Not once, not twice. This becomes a decades-long battle. Lawsuit after lawsuit, arguing that the government is deleting or softening passages about wartime actions that students should be allowed to read. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Lawsuits? Boring. They are, until you realize what they actually do to memory. Here's the thing about lawsuits. A lawsuit turns a hidden argument into a public record. It forces statements into documents. It forces people to pick a side. It forces newspapers to summarize what's being fought over. It forces ordinary people eating breakfast, riding the train, watching evening news, to encounter phrases they might never see in a normal school year. In other words, it turns a quiet cut into a loud dispute. By 1997, Ienaga has been fighting for over 30 years. That's longer than some of you watching this have been alive. He stands on the steps of Japan's Supreme Court after another ruling. And the ruling lands in this weird paradox that feels like two truths at once. On one hand, the court says some specific deletions were illegal. The government can't just erase whatever it wants. That's huge. And yes, this includes passages about biological warfare, about Unit 731, the same territory that got the Devil's Gluttony recalled. On the other hand, the court also says the government can still screen textbooks. The system stays. The scissors remain on the table. So, did he win or lose? Here's where the backfire happens, because even if the power stays, the fight becomes famous. The very existence of the screening system becomes something people discuss openly. Not in academic journals, at dinner, at work, on television. The public learns, clearly, that textbooks are not neutral. They're negotiated. They're battlegrounds. And once people see negotiation, they start wondering, what didn't make it in? What got screened out? That curiosity isn't a side effect. That's a crack in the wall. But Ienaga's lawsuits aren't the only courtroom drama. There's another case that shows how legal battles don't just decide facts, they shape headlines. A former infantryman named Shiro Azuma publishes his wartime diary. It's not written like a politician's carefully crafted memoir. It's personal, blunt. Names, actions, details. A former officer sues him for defamation, claiming Azuma's words damaged his reputation. Azuma loses at the district level. He appeals. Years go by. Now here's the critical thing to understand about courts. They answer specific legal questions based on specific claims. A court might say, "We can't confirm this exact act happened in this exact way," without saying nothing happened and without erasing the larger pattern. But the public doesn't experience court rulings in careful legal language. The public experiences them in headlines, summaries, soundbites, shortcuts. A narrow legal point can be read like a broad moral verdict, and that gap between what the law actually says and what the public hears, that's another way stories escape control. By 1998, Azuma is 80 years old, still standing by what he wrote. He climbs the Supreme Court steps with his lawyer, determined to keep saying, "This is what I did. This is what I saw." And then something even stranger happens. June 1998. Azuma is supposed to fly to the United States for an apology tour. He gets to the airport. A functionary slides a letter across the desk. He's not allowed in, suspected of being a war criminal. Let that sink in for a second. In Japan, his diary is treated as something that harms reputation, something to be contained through defamation lawsuits. In America, the response is basically, "We believe you. That's exactly why you can't come in." An old man trying to apologize is stopped because the other country takes his confession seriously. Even if you disagree with the decision, it does something powerful. It internationalizes the story. It says, this isn't just a domestic argument. The outside world is watching, judging, and acting. And once a story becomes global, it becomes nearly impossible to keep it local and quiet. So the second moment isn't just about one lawsuit. It's a pattern of what lawsuits do. They can be meant to narrow a story, to control it, to keep it reasonable. But legal battles often do the exact opposite. They drag the argument into daylight. They force details into public view. They teach the public that history is being managed. And once people learn that, they start checking for themselves. Which leads us to the third moment, and this one involves the biggest, loudest gate of all: television. If textbooks shape what children learn, television shapes what whole families absorb at the same time, on the same night, with the same images flickering across their living rooms. And that makes TV an extremely tempting place for institutions to manage a story. Not by saying, "This didn't happen," that's too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, you change the tone. You cut a segment. You adjust a sentence. You shift emphasis until the story still exists, but it lands softer, weaker, less dangerous. January 30th, 2001. A producer named Satoru Nagai is in a control room in Tokyo. A segment about wartime sexual violence is prepared for broadcast. He knows what he handed over. And he knows what's going out on air isn't the same. Lines are softened, parts are cut. The programme's direction tilts away from what the reporting actually found. Later, NHK leadership says the changes were routine editorial decisions. There it is again. Remember photo problem? This is the same playbook. Institutional language designed to lower the temperature, to make it sound boring, normal, nothing to see here. But Nagai believes the edits narrowed the truth, and he does something that turns a private edit into a public fight. He speaks out. That moment, that decision to break silence, that's when the backfire begins. Because it makes viewers ask that same dangerous question again. Why did you change it? Once again, the argument isn't only about history. It's about the present. It's about who controls the microphone. Who decides what 10 million people see on a Wednesday night? And when that argument breaks into public view, it spreads like wildfire. Because even people who feel unsure about the past can still have a strong opinion about transparency. People can disagree about interpretation, but they hate feeling manipulated. So the attempted control, the edit, doesn't just weaken the story, it creates a second story on top of it, the story of the edit itself. But here's where the third moment becomes bigger than television. Way bigger. Because while large institutions are fighting over what millions see at once, something else is happening in the margins. Something quieter. Something harder to control. Osaka, mid-1990s. A teacher named Tamaki Matsuoka is doing something that looks completely ordinary. She's sitting in living rooms with a cassette recorder. Her students have been asking questions, they're noticing gaps, they're sensing that certain topics are treated like fog, always there, never clear. So Matsuoka starts collecting voices. Veterans who are finally willing to talk, survivors from the other side of the war, testimony that doesn't fit neatly into one patriotic frame or one victim narrative. She doesn't do it once. She doesn't do it as a publicity stunt. She does it over and over, weekends, evenings, for years. The tapes stack up. Names, dates, places. The quiet work of building a record that can't be edited from a control room. One man in his 70s sits across from her. Before he speaks, he looks at his wife. It's a small gesture, but it tells you everything. This isn't just history. This is marriage, memory, shame, fear. The risk of being judged by the person who shares your bed. Then he raises his hands, sets them down, and starts talking. The cassette turns. That detail matters, because once testimony becomes physical, once it exists as a tape, as transcript pages, as something that can be copied, the game changes completely. You can still try to block it, but blocking it becomes exponentially harder. Matsuoka publishes a slim book, built from years of those interviews. In a classroom, students pass it from hand to hand, reading words that came from those living room conversations, words that were locked inside someone's chest for 50 years. And a new kind of education begins. Not the official kind, the kind sparked by questions, the kind that starts with, "Why wasn't this in our textbook?" From there, screenings begin. Small theatres, civic centres, community rooms, sometimes overseas at film festivals. The scale isn't national television, but here's the advantage: it's much harder to control. A broadcast can be edited by 3 executives in a boardroom. A screening can happen almost anywhere: a church basement, a university lecture hall, someone's garage with a projector. And small screenings have strange power. They create conversation in real time. Afterward, people ask questions, people argue, people exchange contact information. They recommend it to friends. They bring someone next time. It moves through networks like roots spreading underground. And then the protesters show up. Flyers warning people away, shouting in lobbies, pressure campaigns meant to intimidate people from attending. But here's what protesters don't understand. Protests can do something they absolutely don't intend to do. They can announce importance. They act like a neon sign that says, "This is dangerous to someone." For some people, that's a reason to avoid it. For others, it's a reason to walk in. That's not theory, that's how scarcity worked with The Devil's Gluttony in 1983. That's how screening worked in the textbook battles. That's how routine edits work on television. When you feel a hand on the scale, you start looking for what it's trying to push down. So now we've seen all 3 moments, and when you put them together, you start to see something bigger. Over time, these moments echo. They overlap, they reinforce each other. Years later, anniversaries bring old fights back. New documentaries look at the 1983 recall. Academic papers cite the Iyanaga lawsuits. Journalists revisit the 2001 television controversy. Memory doesn't move in a straight line. It loops. It returns. It gets triggered by new arguments in the present. And in those loops, the gatekeepers keep losing something critical: invisibility. If the gatekeeper is invisible, the public accepts the gate as normal. They don't question it. They don't even see it. But when the gatekeeper becomes visible, when the public can see the scissors, the edit button, the recall order, the gate becomes suspicious. People start going around it. That's the real through line across these three moments. A publisher tries to manage a book quietly. The recall makes people hunt it down nationwide. A screening system tries to manage textbooks carefully. Lawsuits make the screening itself a national conversation. A broadcaster tries to manage a program responsibly. The pushback drives people towards smaller records, independent venues, and direct testimony. None of these gates were trying to amplify the truth, but each attempt to control the story made the public more aware that the story was being controlled. And that awareness is fuel, because once people suspect a story is being softened, they stop waiting to be told. They start looking. They search for used copies. They read court coverage. They attend small screenings. They share sources. They ask teachers questions adults hoped would fade away. History doesn't always arrive as one big verdict read from a bench or broadcast from a tower. Sometimes it spreads through 1,000 smaller moments. A pallet rolling backward in a warehouse. A tape recorder clicking on. A producer saying, "That's not what we made." A student raising a hand. Picture this: a quiet classroom late in the day. A portable speaker on the desk. Afternoon light cutting across the whiteboard. Students listening to a voice that was once locked inside somebody's chest for 50 years. No judge walks in to make it official. No government spokesperson steps up to approve it. No television executive decides what to cut. The room just listens. And when the tape stops, nobody moves for a second. That silence matters, because it shows the final limit of gatekeeping. You can block a broadcast. You can soften a sentence. You can recall a book. You can demand a textbook change. But once a person hears a story clearly, once it lands inside them, it becomes part of what they know. And what people know has a habit of spreading, especially when they discover someone tried to keep them from knowing it. So when a gate closes, listen for the noise it makes. Because a lot of the time, that noise is how the truth gets out. If this pattern interests you, you'll probably want to see how it plays out in other countries. The algorithm is showing you some related videos right now. And if you want more deep dives into how information gets controlled and how it escapes that control, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. Drop a comment if you've seen this pattern somewhere else. Because once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Thanks for watching. And remember, the harder someone tries to hide something, the more interesting it probably is.